Welcome to the podcast. As we approach a seminal election in America, there's a lot of finger pointing, and we've heard plenty of allegations of a stolen election. Specifically, Donald Trump, his supporters, and the Republicans have alleged that the Democrats stole the 2020 election. Of course, there's no evidence at all of that, but there was, we believe, a stolen election in American history, and it came in 1980, but the people who appear to have stolen the election were Republicans. It's called the October surprise. Now, you may have heard of it. That term is commonly used to reference when something happens in the month before the election that alters the outcome. However, in this case, it's about something that didn't happen. Specifically, 52 American hostages held by the Iranians, expected to be released due to negotiations by President Jimmy Carter, were not released and were held until Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush became president. This is documented in a number of places, including a new book by journalist Craig Unker called Den of Spies. And the evidence does seem to point to the horrible scenario that treason was committed by our own citizens and that the election was stolen. Now, if that's true, it had profound implications for this country and the world. Specifically, Reagan and Bush had 8 years in the White House. Then Bush had his own 4 years in the White House. And years later, his son, George W. Bush, had another 8 years in the White House. And boy, did this country and the world change. Among many things, we saw 2 wars launched in the Middle East by the Bushes, and we saw the radicalization of Muslim elements that have resulted in the recriminations we see today. We also saw other things such as the empowering of the corporate state, the takeover of the Supreme Court, and the loss of women's reproductive rights. Obviously, this ancient history is profoundly important, especially since a large number of Americans think that it is Democrats, not Republicans, who steal elections. We're going to talk about this today with my guest, John Limbert. John was one of those 52 hostages who were held in Iran for 444 days. John, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Russ. Well, with that introduction, I didn't realize that we had a role in all these disastrous events that you listed. But that's pretty scary to think we had a role, albeit a supporting one, in all that happened.
Well, let's start with you. Just very, very briefly, do you want to give us your background and how you ended up in Iran?
Sure. I had been in Iran in the 60s and early 70s as a Peace Corps volunteer, as a teacher at the university there. My wife is Iranian. My children are born there, half Iranian. So my ties go way back, probably about 60 years. With Iran, I joined the U.S. Foreign Service in 1973, but I didn't serve there. When they asked, "Do you want?" I mean, I knew the language, I knew the country, but I said, "No, I don't want to serve there because there are a lot of things about our policy there that I'm not happy about. I think they're unhappy. We're too close to the Shah." We're too identified with the abuses of his and corruption of his regime. It's not healthy. And I knew if I went there as a junior foreign service officer, low-ranking foreign service officer, views like that would not have been welcomed or very popular. So I served elsewhere until 1979, when the revolution occurred. And the State Department said, "Look, we're in a whole different situation. We don't understand what's going on. We need people there who might help us to understand." Well, the Foreign Service that's service. That's the name of the game. So I did volunteer. I talked to my family about it, and they said, "Look, we know could be difficult, might even be a little dangerous, but you should go. If you don't, you'll always regret it. So I went there in August of '79 to serve in the embassy, and of course, what I tell people is I was not there as long as I was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a 3-year assignment, but I was there longer than I wanted to be, because about 2.5 months after I got there, of course, on November 4th, we have the anniversary coming up very soon, November 4th of 1979, in reaction to President Carter's admitting the Shah to the U.S. for medical treatment. Our embassy was stormed, it was taken, and what started off as a 1970s style student protest sit-in, turned into an international melodrama, if you like, brought the two countries to the verge of war, and cost President Carter his office, and as you noted earlier, brought Reagan to power and gave us 12 years of Republican administration.
Right. And of course, what we saw in the news at that time, every single day was a clock or something like a clock, a countdown thing with the days. They would say, today is day 12, today is day 162, and so on. And so it was indelible in people's minds, and everybody was looking to Carter to get you all out. And of course, he was making great efforts to do so. Can you briefly describe what he was doing, and then why at the time you thought, or the public thought, that those efforts were unsuccessful?
No, I'm probably the last person you should ask, because we were completely cut off. We were at the bottom of the food chain as far as information goes. We were completely cut off from information. I think I was one of the few people who didn't watch those Nightline broadcasts. Everybody else did. I got back and people said, "What did you think of those?" I said, "What do I know? What do I know? Never seen them. Don't know who Ted Koppel is. Never saw these things." But in retrospect, I mean, of course, because we had no television, no newspapers, no radio, no access to any kind of news at all. But it's very clear that this started off, as I said, as a student style sit-in, and our assumption was, and a lot of people's assumption was, that 24 hours, 48 hours, the adults in the room would step in and resolve it. Well, it didn't happen that way, because shades of January 6th, 2021, the people in charge decided they could use this thing. This was useful. This could mobilize public opinion in the direction that they wanted. So Khomeini himself, who really was the only person who had the power to say, no, this has got to stop, instead of doing what he should have done, he endorsed it. He endorsed the riot. He endorsed the rioters. As I said, shades of Washington on January 6th. Once that happened, we were stuck. And it moved to a whole different, I mean, even the guards, even the people who took us, they were caught by surprise, and they said, "This is no longer in our hands." It became a huge political thing. And then, of course, as the saying goes, Houston, we have a problem. And President Carter had an enormous problem. And not only did the Iranians see this as or certain factors, certain hardline Iranians saw this as a opportunity to be exploited, but as we are learning now, certain politicians, certain American Republican politicians, also saw an opportunity in this. And neither of them, both of them, took advantage of it.
put. And so let's kind of fast forward through this. So as far as the public knew at the time, Jimmy Carter was just not strong enough, competent enough, effective enough to be able to bring the hostages home. I think certainly the media played a role in presenting that idea. And so, despite tremendous efforts and high hopes, continuous hopes that a deal was going to be made and so forth, it was not. And Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale lost in 1980. And what happened the day that Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were inaugurated? What happened?
Well, that was the day, that was the day, we were released. And if you, not only was the day we were released, the plane carrying us took off like 15 minutes after, or maybe even less time after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Now, if you believe that's a coincidence, I have a bridge here in Brooklyn, very close by, that I'd be happy to sell you, because no, in fact, as a matter of fact, Russ, in way back 4 months earlier, September, 3 or 4 months earlier, before we were released, September of 1980, the deal was done. Basically, the deal was done. The agreement had been reached between Warren Christopher from the State Department, Deputy Secretary of State, and Sadegh Tabatabai, who was the Iranian representative, and they made the deal, and it was just a matter of details. It mattered for the lawyers and the bankers to work out the details. It didn't happen. Why did it take? And the question is, why did it take why did it take 4 months longer to get us out? Well, now, thanks to journalists like yourself and like Craig Unger and Bob Perry and people like researchers like Gary Sick and others, now we know why it took 4 months.
Isn't it interesting, though? And we saw certainly Craig, and he tells the story in his book. But I think all of the people who worked on that story faced criticism by establishment media. They weren't open to the idea that there was more going on here. Craig, in particular, suffered. And again, I think he tells his story about that. He suffered greatly, I think, his professional reputation, his ability to do his work. And so, in a sense, his book coming out now is a bit of a triumph. But I think for all of us who worked on it at the time and believed that there was more there, we're still just reeling, from the idea that so many decades later, and by the way, it's not like this is accepted yet. If you go to things like Wikipedia, it will mention this theory about October surprise, but the evidence seems to be overwhelming that William Casey, the chairman of the Reagan-Bush campaign, working with others, and quite possibly George H.W. Bush, may have held meetings with the Iranians in Europe about this deal and about holding the hostages longer, which, of course, if you're asking foreigners to hold your own citizens for a while, that is treason. There's no two ways about it. When did you begin to learn this alternative history, shall we say?
This will. I think Craig mentions this in his book, but basically it was the same day that we landed in the United States after coming out of Iran, which was, I think we came out on the 20th of January. We landed sometime around landed in upstate New York around the 25th of January. And I met my family there, my wife and my children, and we got on this bus to go to West Point. And the first thing my wife said to me was, you were there longer than you had to be. The Republicans kept you there for an extra couple of months. And my reaction was, what? What are you talking about? And she said, yeah, that's what happened. That's what happened. And I said, well, how do you know this? I mean, she said, there was a deal. The fix was in. to do it to help defeat Carter, which the Iranians were perfectly happy with. I mean, Khomeini viscerally disliked Carter and visceral dislike for him. So the people wanting to keep us, the Americans wanting to keep us, were pushing on an open door in a way. And so I asked her, I said, that's odd. That sounds really strange. How do you know this? And she said, because I was, while you were in Tehran, you were tied up in Tehran, so to speak. While you were tied up in Tehran, I was working at the American consulate in Saudi Arabia. And I spoke to Iranians coming from Iran seeking visas to the United States. And when I didn't tell them who I was, but I asked them about the situation with the hostages. And she said, and they would say, Madam, don't worry. The fix is in. There's a deal on between the Republicans and our people in charge. And as soon as the point is to get Carter out and to humiliate him. And as soon as he's defeated, they'll make a deal. They'll make a deal. And I said, to this day, I asked myself, how was it that every Hassan and Hussein in Tehran on the street knew about this? And we didn't know about it with any authority until 40 some years later.
Just amazing.
So that's how that was my wake up. But again, I was dubious. I mean, the one thing that I did know was that, Casey was certainly capable of doing something like this. Whether Reagan himself was involved, I don't know. Who else was in other names? But when you mention Casey and you say, was he capable of something like this? Of course he would have been.
And of course, what happened after Reagan won? He appointed Casey to be the CIA director.
Well, exactly.
And then we had all these things like the Iran-Contra scandal, which is related. We don't have time here to go into all that, but again, an Iranian connection with deals, backdoor deals. Then we had all these other things like the BCCI scandal with a strange international bank and a lot of very, very odd things going on. We don't really understand practically any of these things. And I'm just curious, when we watch television, typically they'll have, some person like yourself, somebody from the State Department on talking about things. When you watch television now and you see official people on speaking, how do you react? What's going through your mind?
Well, a lot of them I know. A lot of them are my friends, and they're good people. They're honorable people. And I mean, I was in the Foreign Service for 35 years. I served under Democratic presidents. I served under Republican presidents. I think I was proud to serve my country, and I think I served it honorably. But what's difficult is that these honorable people. As I said, many of them I know or know by reputation. People like Bill Burns or Tony Blinken or these people. So it's really hard to accept that people in power are capable of doing the kind of things that you describe, the kind of double dealing that you describe, the kind of dishonorable activities. Because we like to think of ourselves as Americans, we like to think of ourselves as better than that. I spent, in my Foreign Service time, I spent years preaching sermons about transparency and democracy and peaceful transfer of power and so forth and so on. And I remember telling, some politician in Africa, I saying, "Sir, you have to be ready to accept the fact you could lose an election." That was prophetic, wasn't it? Wasn't that? I think about that now and how prophetic that was. So this is now. If you say these things and you advocate these things, the assumption is you have to believe in them. You aren't just blathering on about something. because we do believe in our, what our system is supposed to be. There's supposed to be democracy. There's supposed to be fairness. There's supposed to be transparency. We're supposed to have peaceful transfers of power. And so it's very difficult to all sort of do a 180 turnaround and say, my gosh, when I say these things, I was just whistling Dixie. I really wasn't, didn't know what I was talking about. And the reality is something quite different and something much nastier.
And let's just compare briefly the fact that Reagan and Bush ran on an anti-government plane. They were very, very critical of government. Remember, they wanted to strangle government in its cradle. They brought in all these people who deregulated everything, very, very pro-corporate. They wanted the government to be much, much smaller, and of course, it is much smaller. And now you have Donald Trump railing at government employees, and we see now even putting the FEMA workers at risk by inciting people who are basically going after the rescue workers. I mean, that's how bad things have gotten. So I think we can see that there are antecedents to what's happening today, that there's a long history here that has not been well understood and has not been well discussed. And so I'm just thrilled that you and I met and that we were able to discuss this. Hopefully get you back on at some point and talk a little bit more. But I really appreciate your coming on. And I know that our listeners are going to be very interested in Craig's book and learning more about this incredible episode, little known episode in American history. That's our talk for today. We'll be doing more of these. So if you have any feedback, including people you think I ought to interview, please let me know. And thanks for listening.